Everyone here is looking for an edge from customer experience, and that's why you're here. A peek around the corner that shows you what's next or what you need to do is, I think, why all of you are here. We also know, since CX has been around now for almost 20 years, that it works. There's lots of proof. There's lots of case studies. The challenge is that 70% of CX projects, digital transformation projects, and new businesses often fail to meet their expectations. And I wondered why that was. And I wondered how I might be able to help you guys see some things that would make it better for you. So I researched 10 companies from around the world. I've been around for a while, so I know people to call. And I found 10 who had been exceptionally good at transforming themselves. And from those, I picked a couple. And one pattern emerged that every single successful company used in order to get breakthrough results. And these are the top winners in every category. And I'll share that with you, but I'd like to do it through story. Can I get a volunteer to do this for me so I don't have to fumble with it? I know it's not a hard job. There you go, thanks. All right, next slide, please. And one more. So I've been a Comcast customer for about 20 years. And the first 10 years, there was nothing exceptional about it. I turned my TV on, everything kind of works. But then we started getting all these new channels and Xfinity and new technology, plus a neighborhood got built behind our house, which means cable cuts and construction and all of that. So all of a sudden, I had all kinds of reasons to call the company. And it was awful. It was dreadful. I had to wait on hold for 20 to 30 minutes just to get a hold of somebody. It took them an 8-hour window to deliver a truck. They would ask me to diagnose my own problem. Have you tried this? Have you tried that? It was terrible. And even the reps were rude to me. That was like status quo for Comcast about 10 years ago. I see some head shaking in the room. You guys know what it's like with your utility provider. So finally, the truck would come, but the guy didn't know what to do, or he didn't have the right parts. One day, we had 3 trucks show up at our house. This was so cool. I was so excited, but so sad for the other 2 people that weren't getting service. And they couldn't solve the problem, so they all came back the next day. That's the kind of customer service we were dealing with. I even was so mad, and the service was so bad, that I tried to reach out to Comcast and pitch my services as a customer experience designer to them. And I called and called and called to try to find out who could I talk to. But the problem was, there was no one to talk to. There was no one leading the customer experience. But the story gets a little bit better. 18 months ago, my personal experience started getting better with Comcast. Hold times were shorter, attitudes of the people were a lot better, and there was a personal connection that I could feel every time I talked with people on the phone. The reps didn't just make me feel good, they actually did stuff for me. They could reset my cable modem, adjust my bill. They could roll a truck now with a 2-hour service window. These things were all amazing. But it got better than that, because all of a sudden, we'd start getting new equipment showing up at our house without asking for it. If we had a service failure, it would be automatic. We got a $20 credit automatically put on our bill. And we got a text 20 minutes before the text would show up. How do they do that? How do they go from like worst to you got my attention? And I thought, this isn't all for me. I'm just one customer. They have millions and millions and millions of customers. So how do they do that at scale? So here comes the case study part. I did some dialing around. I made some calls to friends, and I got in touch with Kyle McSlero. He's the Senior Vice President of Customer Experience at Comcast. And here's the recipe. This is what they did. In May of 2015, his boss came into power, if you will, and started with a simple mandate, which was to think and grow differently. That was the mandate. That's all they had to work with. I was sitting over here at the conversation a little while ago, and a new customer experience manager gets very little instructions to go forward with, and that's pretty typical. What he brought to the table, besides that mandate, was the notion of doing everything to the 10x. It's got to be 10 times better. Whatever it is, we're going to make it 10 times better. So that was his dual mandate. He put in a great team, and they started doing some work on Net Promoter Score. It gets interesting here. The aggregate data was really easy for the organization to swallow. X number of this, 25% of that, and so on. But when it came to personalized data, that kind of gave the company indigestion at an institutional level. They didn't quite understand that. So I dug in and I asked why, and he said, well, this company's been around since like whenever, 53, 63, I don't remember the date, but for 40 years, they've been all about operational excellence. So when it comes to service, around here, that means everything has to be the same. That was the mentality they were fighting. They were going for the aggregate measures, which meant like 50,000 people had to be happy. We need to raise the number for 50,000 people. But one person, sorry, Charlie, too bad for you. That was the mentality. So what they decided to do was a real typical strategy called one-call resolution. And the idea there is that on the first call, as many customer problems that can be taken care of are taken care of. It's not rocket science, but it's a strategy that really does work. The customer service reps on the front lines have the ability to commit the company's resources, and they get to call the shots. So it's very much like the Army's Army of One program, if you're familiar with that. As soon as they got that stuff connected on the back end, things started humming. And that's why I was getting the amazingly better experience than I did before. Everything was coordinated. What they did internally to make that work were two things. In addition to putting CSRs who are already on the front line in charge, they also did this thing called huddles. And a huddle, much like a football huddle, is a stand-up morning meeting with your team, and you talk about what you're going to do, what you need help with, and you make commitments to each other for that day to get things done. That was cathartic for them. That was a big culture shift, but they leaned into it very well. A lot of companies use that. They also had their own homegrown innovation and business improvement process that they called elevations. And through that, they were able to get the back end of the business, the software, the programming, the new commitments, the behaviors, the metrics, the incentives, all of that stuff kind of lined up. I'm sure that's its own presentation. I'm going over it in about 10 seconds. What they're doing now is going beyond one-call resolution to predictive service. And I think you've heard that word a couple of times today. Using machine learning and artificial intelligence, they're able to reduce times, shorten queues, move customers to just the right place. And the other thing that they're doing, which is pretty cool, is they're putting customer experience at the beginning of every single product and service development process. So basically, you can't launch anything new unless the customer experience is a part of it. That's a very wise decision. But now they've got the infrastructure to do all of that. The bottom line for them is the bottom line for everybody. The more automation you have with better personalization means you get mass customization. And that means better service at lower cost. Okay? Next slide, please. There you go. So what can you borrow from this Comcast lesson? Well, they did three things. The first one is they set a big, bold, customer-focused goal. Every one of you can do exactly the same thing. And they broke their addiction to the ROIs and the KPIs and the quarterly sales incentives. Those things are actually a little bit dangerous to work with as a CX practitioner, especially for those of you that are brand new. When people come to you and they're asking for an ROI, they're asking you to use yesterday's machinery to create tomorrow's results. They're basically saying, we want to be different, but keep all of our other stuff the same. And that's something that should really raise your antenna, because it's just impossible to do that. I know a lot of practitioners who are going after these small wins, quick wins. It's not always possible to make a big change happen if you're trying to go after small wins. Because if you're only going like a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, your competition's going like this. It's like guaranteed not a winning situation. You can't get to first place unless you're willing to break something big. And ROI is one of those things. So instead of the quick wins that just paid homage to the status quo, what these guys did was they envisioned the terrific experience first. Yes, a combination of data and analytics and journey maps, but also some good human intuition, some insight from the front lines, very qualitative, very personal. And they did a detailed future story. All 10 of the companies that I researched, including Eon and LeasePlan and Budapest Bank and a bunch of others, they all started with a detailed picture of the future that could happen. Then they asked their teams to make it happen. The story became the strategy. And after they got the story right, they made it real. So you go from story to make the story your everyday, and then you make it profitable. The common mentality in American business today is to make it profitable as you're building something new. And that basically strips all of your resources away. It takes away your flexibility. It makes it impossible for you to do what needs to be done for the customer, and it kills your creativity. So those are the 3 things that every single of the 10 companies did that I found. So the bottom line for Comcast was they broke with convention. They created value for customers first, and then they let the stakeholders, the shareholders, take their piece later. Am I done? No, okay. So with good design, everybody gets more of what they want. Can I have the next slide, please? 1,000 years ago, we lived in the Dark Ages. Not us, but our predecessors, our great-great-great-grandparents. And they had very, very basic lives. They basically didn't take baths, and they had to fight really hard to eat some crumbs. And at night, what do you think they did? They just kind of looked at the moon because there was not much to do. So what are you guys going to do tonight? You're going to go home, take a nice, warm, soapy shower. You're going to have a hot meal that's well-balanced and good for you, and you're going to curl up with a book or watch one of your favorite shows in a dry house that's set to the temperature that you like. Where did all that come from? It came from previous generations' innovations. There's been so much positive change in the last 1,000 years. What would it be like if all the people back then in the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages and from those times until now, what if all the folks that resisted, the ones that said no, the ones that said, no way, I don't want to try anything new, what if they won? What if that's the way the world was? What would your world be like today if you didn't have the benefit of last generation's innovation? Just think about that for a second as we move into next story, please. Who has the clicker? There you go. So the second story is a small micro company called Audio Alternatives. They're based right here in Atlanta. They're a client of mine. So for 20 years, they operated the magic, it was like a secret store for audiophiles all over the country. If you wanted the very best gear, if you wanted to spend $250,000 or $500,000 on your stereo, this is the place that you would go. The challenge for them was that they knew all the technical specs, and they competed on the quality of sound reproduction, the science of sound reproduction. And there are only a few folks that really care about that and that could afford their stuff, and those numbers were kind of dwindling, so they needed to do something. Through a client, I was referred in as a customer experience designer, and I worked with Alan Jones. And Alan took me on he gave me his store experience, and it actually blew me away. He had me sit down on this sofa right in the center with these giant Vandersteen speakers aimed right at me, and those are the $250,000 speakers, and they're worth every penny. I closed my eyes, and I swear I could see where every single musician was in front of me. The sound was so good. It actually blew me away. I felt like I was inside the music. So after I had that experience, I kind of knew what he was talking about. Now the trick was to turn it into an experience. So I recommended 3 steps to them. The first one was to move focus from products to customers. Annette talked about that earlier. Don't focus so much on the products. Don't ignore products, but don't focus on them. Put customers first. The second one was to educate the team that people come for the experience of listening to the music, not for the box that produces it. And that changes all of the store dynamics. The third thing was to switch from telling everything they know and selling everything they have to engineering discovery moments for the clients. Does that make sense? They've got to find it for themselves because that's what binds people so tight. So they took my advice and they put it into their Traction system. Traction is one of those jobs to get done kind of programs that acts as an operating system for a business. It helps them stay up to date with, I've got to do this today and that tomorrow, keeps them on track with all their goals. So here's what they did. Audio Alternatives bought the name Hi-Fi Buys. For those of you that don't live in the Atlanta area, it was a very popular Circuit City, Best Buy kind of place with 10 stores and $100 million in sales. It went belly up, they bought the name, they slapped it on a store, a nice store, and they put it right in the heart of Buckhead, which is our premier shopping district in Atlanta. They bought a new point of sale system, that's a cash register, and they tied it to the CRM. So now they had intelligence about their customers, they could do follow-ups, emails, web promotions, all that stuff. And they did invitation-only events for men, women, and so on and so on. The cool thing that they just did, and you can see this in the store right now in Buckhead, is they created a headphone bar. The headphone bar, just like a regular bar, is a place where you can walk up to. You don't get drinks, but you can try on all the different gear. You can change the music sources. You can try different combinations of technology and see what it all sounds like. And that's been amazing for them because this headphone bar is introducing a lower cost product that has no installation costs at all. That big gear costs a lot, hike it up the stairs, install it permanently. If you move, it's a pain. So it's hundreds of dollars or low thousands versus tens of thousands. And that's bringing in a lot of young customers. So the business is more profitable because of that. And I'm going to skip a little bit here. What they did in their formula was to create the same thing. They did an audacious customer-centered value proposition, which was get the experience. That's their tagline. They defined the ideal experience first, and then they delivered it. And in this business, they had to drag operations kicking and screaming. They were a marketing-led organization, so it wasn't as hard. And when something doesn't work for them, they just are not afraid to just kind of break through and move ahead. So that's the encouragement I offer each of you. Sorry for the notes here. Okay, so I'd like to ask you one question. What are you willing to break at your companies? What are you willing to break so that you can build a richer, more impactful, and a more memorable experience? Just think about that for a second. What are you willing to put yourself on the line for? What will you put your team on the line for? What's worth it for you to do? What I want you to do, think about, is reassess everything, all the information that you have, all the status quo, and reassess everything that you think, everything that you do. It's all fair game. Use CX on the business, not just for the customer. The same techniques that you're learning for customers and for employees, you can use to engineer the way the business works to make it perform better for the folks on the front line. And maybe what we're doing right now isn't all wrong, but I think we should step back and have the courage to address what is wrong. Because every one of our businesses are facing some challenges. And especially for those of you that are new, when you sense that something is like big and not talked about or it's taboo, that's probably where the organization needs to lean in. And you've got to get clever about how you get it to do that. You don't want to fall on a sword and lose your job because you can't be effective that way. But you do need to figure that out. So that's the kind of behavior from leaders like you that leads to the big breakthroughs. And in order to do that, you have to be willing to break big things.